All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful Wednesday, Thursday, actually. Um, Welcome to our community webinar. This is an initiative we've been running for probably the last year or so, mainly for the purpose of bringing together great people from here at our company and around our community, clients, partners, etc., predominantly in the talent acquisition or people space. So we could share great practices, learn from one another, all for the benefit of elevating and delivering a great recruiting and people experience for whoever it is that we serve ultimately, so that they could have a better shot at achieving their respective visions. For this specific webinar, we're very excited to be joined by Lene Lakay, our VP of People over at Envoy, our client, our friend, former HR leader with Twitter, specifically here to talk to us about the topic of startups versus big tech and comparing the DEI practices at each respective organization type. This is some content that Lene shared with us that we're fortunate to be on the receiving end of at our summit last year, and it received incredibly high marks and feedback from our team, receiving a ton of value, and specifically seeing the value from the lens of talent acquisition, being on such a front line of the representation of culture and the seeing of practices as it relates to DEI, but also being at a fairly challenged and complex point as it relates to the ability to navigate an internal organization to raise awareness and influence in whatever way possible. So received a ton of value, and we're so excited about it that we just had to share it out to the world. And so with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Lene to take it from here. And sorry, before you jump in, Lene, on the logistics front, we expect this to run for about 30 minutes or so. As you have questions, please feel free to pop it in a chat or Q&A. Kirsten from our team will moderate Q&A as soon as we're finished. And also, this will be recorded, so anyone that needs to jump or is not able to make it, we'll go ahead and send out the recording immediately thereafter.
All right, thank you, Boris. First things first, I want to say thank you. Thank you for bringing this type of content to a broader audience. I did attend the summit last year, and it was nice. It was a very intimate setting, and it wasn't recorded. So I'm glad that there was good feedback, and then now I get to share it with a broader audience, and now it's going to be recorded. But before we dive in, I'd like to frame up how we'll spend the next 30-ish minutes together. This webinar was born out of a fireside chat, so it was a little bit different format at the Binc Summit last year. So although we aren't following the exact fireside chat format, I've tried to take the key concepts and themes that came up during the chat and then make it just more digestible for a webinar setting. So in terms of content, I'll be sharing most of the learnings or key concepts through stories. Some of these stories are going to be personal, so please be kind. And most stories are just from my experiences of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work at both, large companies, small companies, at organizations that had 100 years of storied history and those that have single-digit years of history. So it's really just that composition of work over the last 20 years, dare I say 20 years, I can't believe it, but of doing this work. The last framing point I want to make is that in my experience, anytime that I do a talk or a panel around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that I am lucky enough to have an audience of very advanced folks. So my bet is that most of you not only have a passion for this work, but you also have direct experience doing this work at fantastic organizations. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm going to share concepts and stories. It may be validating to work that you're already doing. They may be new concepts, new techniques, and some may be counter to ideas or practices that you're applying today. That means we'll disagree a little bit. And I think that that is okay. I actually welcome that, especially when thinking about the DEI topic. And I truly believe that we'll all find a place in this conversation. So I'm excited to share my point of view. I look forward to hearing from all of you. And we'll do a few kind of interactive polls during the webinar, and then of course have a Q&A section at the end. So it's just a reminder. So let's get started. So now let's talk about what we're going to cover and a little bit more about the point of view that I'm coming from. So we'll be starting with why this is important to me. This story will really be about the passion that fuels my interest in the work. And if we ever had time, or if you want to reach out to me, I love hearing the stories that kind of fuel the passion behind anyone who does this work. So please reach out to me. Maybe we'll do coffee. Then I'm going to give an overview of the types of companies that I worked at. And why this is important is it can help you decide, what makes most sense for your environment. Then I'm going to move into, my point of view. My view is that I take an integrated approach to DEI work, and I'll bring up 5 concepts, themes, practices that come up most often when I'm doing this work. Some of these concepts were surfaced during the fireside chat from last year, and maybe I'll come up with some new concepts post-webinar. And last but not least, we'll do a Q&A and wrap up. So before diving into my story, I would just like to, acknowledge my point of view and where I'm coming from. My understanding is that a majority of the people on the webinar are from a talent acquisition practitioner background, which is fantastic. And I love my talent acquisition partners. Maybe they think I love them, too much, because we always have so much work to do together. We spend so much time together, especially at a small startup. But I want you to know that I will be sharing some stories that are directly applicable to talent acquisition practitioners. But I also will just be sharing some stories from a general HR point of view, as well as a general leader perspective and point of view. So I think there's something for everyone today. And, just kind of go with me, as some of these stories may be more applicable to your certain circumstance than others. So now let's switch gears a bit. I'd like to share a story that is personal to me. The story sheds a bit of light on why this work is important to me. It's just like my underlying fuel for doing this work. This story, I say, is really rooted in and grounded in inclusion, and how being included in systems and programs really changed the trajectory for my family and then for me. The story of inclusion starts with my dad. He was one of 8 kids. He was one of the younger ones, had a single mom, was raised in Compton back in the 60s and 70s. And education just wasn't really emphasized for him or his family. All of his older brothers and sisters, his mom and dad, none of them graduated high school, let alone went on to pursue further education. So in school, he mostly kept his head down. He didn't draw attention to himself. And that was mainly for just some safety reasons as well. He wasn't a good student in terms of grades. He had issues with reading and with basic math. But in 4th grade, the school did a standardized test, and this was given to everybody in the school. And my dad's scores came back, and he had scored well above average in what they called back in those days, like the gifted student category. And this really drew attention from the teachers and the administrators. It's like, who is this kid? This kid that doesn't talk, and, for what we can tell, is not necessarily an academic. And overnight, he was seen as someone with real academic potential. He was told he was smart, he was told he was capable, and he was told that he should be included in the academic system. And from that point on, with that kind of support and attention, he became an A student. He felt that he belonged. He felt that he really had a right to pursue academics and be in this world. He passed this belief on to me and to my brothers. And although most of my family to that point, still hadn't graduated from high school, my dad My siblings, myself, we all graduated from college. And much later in life, my mom, got an associate's degree in her 40s. So I just know personally that it changed the trajectory of my life for my dad to kind of pass down this belief. And then in later generations of younger cousins and my broader family, it really has kind of opened up opportunities for them. And much more of my family is pursuing, work and the type of life that they love. I just feel like a lot of opportunity was unlocked. So, why this is important and why I think it's important for this webinar is just, I feel lucky. I feel lucky to have the opportunities that I have. And I also feel lucky to be able to shape and create environments at work where people can feel included. I draw a lot of energy from making sure that people can do their best work, that every single person could do their best work. So thank you for letting me share that story. I will be shifting into more practical application and content, but wanted you to have that backdrop just so you can get to know me a little bit better. So in order to move us into this practical concepts section, I'd like to know a little bit more about the audience, if I can get a chance here. So we have a quick poll question. And I'm just curious, I don't know this, I haven't been told this, so just curious what size company most of you are coming from, or if we have just like a really great representation across all the types of companies. So if you can click, and I know these are very generic, but click if it's small, medium, or large type organization. We'll see, I see the poll on my side, I hope everyone else can see the poll. Okay, so see this and we'll see. I can't vote, so this is all on you. This is all on the audience. All right. So yeah, I'm seeing a majority in the small and medium. So this is really good. Only one person in the large category. So I'll spend a little bit more time on the small and medium category, and people can obviously keep me honest in the Q&A section as well. So now let's just talk briefly about the size of companies where you've seen this work, where you can see this work and where I've seen this work. So I've worked in a ton of different environments. As I said, I've worked in organizations that were over 100,000 people, global presence, global footprint, all the way up until today, where I would say I'm in the, up and coming organization with less than 10 years history behind me. The company has less than 10 years of history behind it. And what I can tell you is each journey is unique because you're dealing with this different environment, different stage. To oversimplify a little bit, I think when you look at the startup category here of like Envoy, I joined Twitter when it was in the hundreds, I joined Mozilla when it was really small, is the thinking is that you're much more agile, you're edgier, you're experiment-based, and you can really make change in DEI faster, more quickly. I think back to doing this work in kind of larger organizations, what we could call like big tech or just big companies in general. People kind of liken themselves to being more process-oriented, more intentional in how they approach the work. And there is a belief that they can make a larger impact in the world. And really, if you have a footprint over 100,000 folks, you probably are, making a very large impact in the world. So all of these statements are true. Having said that, and lucky enough for all of you, even though these environments are different just based on size and impact and scope, my general approach and the concepts that I'm going to be sharing with you are pretty much the same. Now, the techniques, exactly where you start could be different, but the approach is the same. So my approach is really about integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion into all aspects of the employee experience. So we'll talk a little bit more about this integrated approach. So to me, my definition is, the integrated approach is not about a single program. It's not about a single conference or one initiative. This is really about being conscious and deliberate and making sure that DEI is weaved into every step of that employee experience. What this acknowledges to me is that this is a system and everything is interconnected. And if one part is broken, it's likely that the whole system will not necessarily be optimized. For example, if we have an objective, structured interview process that we're proud of and that makes us feel that we're, taking candidates through a great process, but then the candidates come in the door and the team culture isn't inclusive, then the system won't be as strong as it could be. And in this practical example, you may have to go back and hire for that team over and over again, which isn't great for anyone. So just know that when I'm talking about approach, I'm talking about really integrating, really weaving this into all of the work. And I'm going to share just 5 key concepts that I think can help bring that to life, this integrated approach to life. So let's go into these 5 concepts. So first things first is getting started. I get asked this all the time. It's just like, I have passion, I have this interest, or my company has an interest, like, where do I get started? Next is about partnering. We have to have a leadership partnership when we're doing this work in organizations. Then it's about making a plan. Then I'll talk a little bit about employees as partners and their own separate partnership. And then finally, just touch on creating a safe space when doing this work. So within the 5 concepts, I'll talk through just a framework and a thought process and share some stories along the way. So breaking it up a little bit again, before we get into the concept of getting started and the framework and thought process underlying that, I have another poll question. I'd like to know where everyone's at in their DEI journey. It's okay if you haven't started, that is an option. So haven't started, getting started, midway, far into the process, and maybe you could be doing the next webinar. All of these are great options. Again, I can't vote, so I'm relying on all of you. Oh, okay. So we have that convergence around getting started, which I think is a fun place to be, and a little bit less and kind of haven't started, midway, far into the process. Please reach out to me if you're far into the process later after the webinar. I would love to kind of swap some stories and stuff. I'm always learning there. Okay, well, let's talk about getting started, because I think some of this will be applicable even if you are just in the beginning stages. So I think that this is a good place to start. So what I think about here is really understanding business priorities, using data and insights, and if all else fails, start with your culture. And when I think about culture, I do a simplified definition, which is just take a look at how things get done in your organization. And if you look at it in that perspective, there's kind of solutions everywhere, very small solutions that could be applied quickly everywhere. But why I think it's important to emphasize like understanding business priorities, using the data and insights that is accessible to you, and starting with your own culture, is many times when I was doing the work, especially in my earlier days, I really wanted to start with my own passion first. So it was like, where was I most passionate? What was I most interested in? And if I could just pass down, kind of a lesson from some of my mistakes and my years, it would be that you start with your environment first. And then you can overlay your passion or the passions of the people that are in your organization, which I think could be even more powerful. And so when I talk about understanding business priorities, what this means is, as simple as what's most important for them. What are their objectives? If there are objectives or goals out there, read them. Get to know what your organization is focused on and what they're thinking about. Understand where they're growing and maybe where they're not growing. And this could be that you want to overhaul the hiring process, for the marketing organization. And then you come to find out there's 0 hires in the marketing organization for the year. So then you just don't really have that place to kind of practice some of the work that you wanted to do. So it's really just scanning the environment and making sure to recognize where it makes sense to drive change first. In terms of data and insights, I know we have a lot of people that are more at the medium and small size companies, which is what I'm living today. If you have Tableau or Looker dashboards that you can go into and just get that sampling of your organization, great. And if you don't, you could do this just by hosting a listening tour or reaching out and speaking with people. When I joined Envoy, so a little bit of a story here. When I joined Envoy, I had no talent acquisition team that was in-house. Luckily, I had a team of Binc people that were here to help me. And I'm thankful for that every day, because on day one, it was like, we're double digits employees, we're gonna double, we need to do that as quickly as possible, go. And it was like, whoa, I have to build this team. And before building the team, before tackling any of this, I was able to go to the Binkers that were on site and just do kind of like a listening tour with them. Like, what are our candidates saying? What are the employees saying? How engaged are people? So, I didn't have Tableau charts. I didn't have Looker charts. And I really just went down to the grassroots, bare basics, like, let me talk to the people. And why I'm such a fan of my Binc team is because they were really tuned in and connected to what was going on in the organization. And I was able to use a lot of those insights. So, moral of the story here is just make sure to really understand what's going on in your environment. Next up, next concept, what I will say is no matter where I've done this work, what size company, what stage, is that you need leadership partnership. Sometimes we're lucky enough that it's a top-down directive and there's no getting out of this. Like, our leadership is just really, really passionate in their own way about the work. And sometimes that's not the reality. And so this is more of like a framework on how to operate in either environment. So what I think about is bringing the work back to the business goals. When you're influencing or driving partnership with leaders, it's always about let's bring it back to what you're most focused on. Next, I believe it's just about co-creating solutions. Many times people ask me, how do you drive accountability in an organization? And I go back to have them help create the solution, because that's a surefire way to get real buy-in if they believe it is their idea. Of course, we're the experts in the room, so we can help them shape that and make it actually effective. But there's so many ways that you can co-create with them. And then, view our leaders and our managers as multipliers. They are the ones that have the most impact on a day-to-day basis in the organization, and view them that way and use them in that way. So I want to share just a little story about co-creating a solution and about leveraging our internal talent. And really, this was when I was in my hyper growth days at Twitter, where every day we had a new job rec, we had a new job opening. And what we wanted to do, which I completely agree with, and I take this approach anywhere I go, is we wanted to leverage the talent that was inside of our organization as much as possible prior to bringing in external or outside talent. And so what was going on is that we were tapping people on the shoulder. Managers and leaders were tapping people on the shoulder that they knew and saying, hey, there's a job, you should apply for it, you would be great for this job. And as this went on for a little while, feedback started coming in from the employees to HR and to the talent acquisition partners. And they were saying, I don't really know people and I'm not getting tapped on the shoulder for these types of opportunities. Like, what can I do? And that was one of those things where they brought it to the leaders, they brought it to HR and talent acquisition, and we all sat down and was like, that is not the intention whatsoever. We don't want to exclude people. We don't want it to be just the most known, the most, maybe vocal people about wanting a new opportunity to get these opportunities. And so we created a solution where we put in a structured and objective interview process, internal interview process that was very similar to one we followed for external candidates. So this meant posting the job on our internal job board, marketing it within the organization, holding the rec open for a certain period of time so people were able to raise their hand and express interest. And then doing an interview process, a little lighter touch on like whether or not they'd be a fit for the company because they were already there, but more about the role and their readiness for the role. And this was a huge success. And the reason it was a huge success is because it came out of insights from the employees directly to the leaders. And we were able to partner with the leaders, and they felt bought in, and they felt like they were driving this change within the organization. And if there are any HR leaders out there, what I'll say is like fast forward, this increased our engagement scores on our engagement survey, and it really kind of made us feel as though we were, walking the talk about creating an inclusive environment. So next step is making a plan. So, my top line here is just that we all need structure around our work. I am a believer that you treat integrating DEI into the employee experience. Treat this as you would any other business priority or objective. This is just as important as making the revenue number, as getting, a new logo for a customer, anything like that. So treat it the same. So the 3 steps that I think through, or the framework I think through in terms of making a plan, is just appropriately scoping your plan first, setting some goals, what you measure gets done, and evolving it over time. That is checking in, keep going, be resilient, launch and iterate concept. So I'm going to share a little bit of story around appropriately scoping your plan, which is, where I come up with this cupcake versus wedding cake. I think that this work, it's the type of work that it's so easy to be overwhelmed. You want to create that beautiful wedding cake, multiple tiers. When in reality, at some of these small and medium-sized companies, all you can really do and all your organization can absorb is a cupcake. So I really challenge you to, read and keep up to date in the concepts that are out there around this work, but not necessarily cut and paste. It's not always going to work when you just read what Google's doing as a 100,000 person company over 20 years of history and say, I'm going to implement that at my 100 person company. So where this came up for me is we recently hosted a panel, and we had some expert advice, which was really great. And a piece of advice that they gave to my talent acquisition team members was that we should all be at Grace Hopper, at NSBE, at SHIP, which those are large conferences where you can access diverse talent in the technical space. And like, if you're a company and committed to this work, then you should be at all of those conferences. And so that idea came to me as the leader, and it's like, yes, like I would love to be at all of those conferences, but I have to match this to the resources and the size of team that I have. So I challenged the team to go back and keep with the spirit and intent of those conferences, but think of things in ways that we could do this appropriate for our size. And the team came back, and it happens just as an example that the Anita B org hosts local meetups and local or mini Grace Hoppers that are much more accessible to companies the size of Envoy, where I'm at right now. And that reminded me that in my early days at Twitter, when we were in the hundreds, we didn't attend Grace Hopper and NSBE and SHIP. But by the time I left 6 years later, we were spending in the 6 figures on those events and sending, teams of 10 plus people to those events. So, again, do a plan that's appropriate for your size, set goals, check in, and then evolve. You will evolve these plans as your company changes and grows. Next, and I'll try to speed it up here, is just the employee partnership. We always talk about leadership partnership. And what I like to tell people is like the most powerful group really is the employee base. Just most powerful in terms of numbers, insight, like the best ideas come from here. So stay connected to your employees, amplify the work that they're already doing. I'm sure you can have a couple conversations and you'll find out some great work that's DEI focused that they're already doing, and see them as multipliers in the same way that you see managers as multipliers. Here, a very quick story is that we have ERGs at Envoy, employee resource groups. So groups that build community around, folks' identity. And I'm asked all the time, like, oh my gosh, it's so early. Why do you have ERGs? And this isn't something that I said I'm going to bring from past experience or cut and paste or the silver bullet to approaching DEI work. The birth of the ERG so early at Envoy is because I looked around and I saw what work was going on, and there was already a bunch of grassroots work going on here. They had already started the ERGs themselves. And what I did was just come in to help amplify their great work and their voices. ERGs can exist at large companies, and they can also exist at small companies if it makes sense. So finally, I always like to weave in just creating a safe space. This work is hard, and we have lots of different viewpoints and counter viewpoints, even if we come from diverse backgrounds. And my belief is that if you really want to unlock breakthroughs, and that's what we need in the DEI work in the tech space in particular right now, that we need to have that concept of psychological safety. We need to encourage everyone to create a safe space around this. And when I'm thinking about this, I think about in the ways of stay curious, learn from your mistakes, and just stay open to how the space is evolving and how your organization is evolving. And in the interest of time, I do want to get to some Q&A so we can interact with all of you a bit, and I'm sure I'll share a story or two as part of the Q&A section.
Great. I'm going to launch a quick poll, and then we will jump right into questions. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box or into the Q&A box. Okay, and we have gotten a couple. The first question, Lene, is what are potential roadblocks?
Okay. I feel like you can hit roadblocks and landmines everywhere in this work. I'll go back to a couple of points that I made. I think, one roadblock comes up when you don't really scan the environment and make sure that you are proposing solutions or starting at a place that makes sense for your organization. Earlier in my career, and even today, I do this all the time, and I'll talk a little bit about a mistake, is I'm coming off the heels of working at Twitter, which is a very open environment to this conversation, and I came into Envoy with that same energy. And one of the first priorities I wanted to have on my people agenda at Envoy was, let's gather our diversity data, let's share it with everyone, let's start creating plans. And one of the things that I just wasn't aware of is that, the organization wasn't necessarily ready for that right then. We didn't even have an HRIS, like an HR system to have people opt in and self-ID. Some of the leaders that I was working with, they'd never been exposed to these concepts. So it was more like, I want to be a bit more educated before I start representing this with my team and having this conversation. So I think roadblocks really come up when you're not scanning that environment and making sure that you're bringing the solution that's appropriate for the time and place of your organization.
And our next question is, do you have any resources around conferences or in-person events that would be helpful as a company looks to grow their people and DEI initiatives?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm guessing we have, even just a lot of allies on the webinar as well, is let me get very simple. You can use Google, and I don't mean that in a condescending way in any way, shape, or form, but in my startup experience now, Google has been such a friend, and I will just search things and search for small conferences that are applicable to startups. One of the ones that I mentioned that my team found was these Grace Hopper Minis, which are more local events. Another one that we love to go to is Afrotech, which is local to the Bay Area and much more accessible from kind of a cost and resource standpoint. also, I keep in touch by reading the Paradigm blogs. I don't know if anybody has heard of Paradigm, but we've used them a few times, and then I read their blogs. And then one thing that I have on my to-do list is we hosted a diversity panel for Black Heritage Month recently at Envoy. And one of the panelists was just like, read books that are out there about this topic. And so I have one in my list that I'm gonna share here. It's called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And this was recommended as like just a way for myself and others to just become informed about, the journey and the experience of Blacks in technology in particular. So I'd say there's a lot of resources out there and at people's disposal.
And our next question is, how do you deal with disappointment of employees who want you to be doing more than your company has bandwidth for? I want to hear the request to do the most and the best, but I know that's not as always possible. So I wonder what I can say to keep people pushing for those great solutions, but not feeling like we're failing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm experiencing that every single day, and I have at all of the companies that I've worked at. The first thing is it really gets me, really pumped up because it's like people have so much passion and they really want to do this work, and that's energizing. So I love that all the energy is there. I go back again to the concepts, which is make a plan, communicate the plan, say why you're doing what you're doing, and say why you can't do some of these other things yet. It's not like you'll never do them, but maybe right now is not the right time. And then consistently communicate back to the organization, create these feedback loops, and then iterate, evolve, just like you would any other business objective. And I go back to that story. I remember in my early days at Twitter where we wanted to go to the Grace Hoppers of the world, and it was simply we cannot resource this right now. But then fast forward, and they're one of the primary kind of participants at Grace Hopper and sponsor things. So the good thing to note is that like your company will get there. If that passion and that energy is there, it will get there. But go back to a plan, set some goals, communicate, and be open to evolving.
Our next question is, assuming that not every office will be as woke as companies based in some of our major tech hubs, examples such as Bay, BYC, STL, how do you go about getting consistent buy-in across distributed teams?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I believe that you can have an overarching umbrella of what you want to achieve for the organization. So develop a company-wide philosophy around DEI, or approach, as I am calling out this integrated approach. But you must be open to using tactics and techniques and a strategy that's appropriate for the market. And that's really where this can get complex and very exciting and be some of the best learning experiences. I'll give an example is I spent a lot of time in a global role in my last role. And when I went to Brazil and Latin America, there was zero issue with gender representation. Females were, dominant, and they were actually over 50% representation in all the roles down there. And so some of the work that we were doing in our SF hub just wouldn't have made sense for down there. So it was more about saying, here's what we're doing at the company-wide level. Here's our belief, here's our philosophy. But let me sit down with the local leadership team and decide what we do for them in terms of their local strategy or their local plan. This is where it gets, like I said, exciting and complex, and where it does serve a company at that time to maybe have a dedicated person in this role so that they can really be the centralized point and help people create plans that most suit their markets and their geographies.
Great. One person said, love the idea of having ERGs to create a safe space, but how or should we partner with them to drive other DEI?
Yeah. So I'll say that in year one, right now for Envoy, I have set some parameters that let's make sure that we can create that safe space and do community. I don't expect that to be the emphasis or the only thing in year two, in year three. But really it was about like, let's scope this in a way that makes sense for the organization. We're also growing and changing and did product launches and all this other stuff. So I want people to make sure that they have the time and the space to do all the great things that they're doing. But I do believe that it goes beyond that. It goes into how can we influence and shape and co-create the candidate experience, who we hire, who we attract into the organization from an authentic place. And then I think the ultimate is how do we kind of shape, influence the products and the services that the organization offers in an authentic way. And one thing that, I give all the credit to the employees here. We have such passionate employees at Envoy, and we have a woman in our marketing organization who is a lead for an ERG, and she has this passion. And as part of her work, she has to create content. And she approaches this content from a DEI perspective, from that integrated perspective. And so when she had to create content around describing great workplaces or elevating your workplaces, she decided to infuse and embed content around DEI into the whole platform of how do you elevate or make your workplace better. So I say that, because she had a safe space, because she had community here, she felt safe enough and brave enough to bring that into her work and really help shape how we show up in the broader world for our customers and for everyone. So it really is kind of 3 steps of like, yes, create community, yes, be the advocate for the culture, for the types of people that you have in your organization, and then eventually get to that place of influencing the services and the products. But it is a step changes, and do what you can absorb as an individual, as well as, what makes sense with your work and what's going on in the organization.
There's a follow-up question on ERGs, and it's any tips on how to start ERGs when we don't have any HR or people team? I'd love to create this safe space and open up the conversation of inclusion for all employees, but I'm not sure how to approach this coming from me as a white privileged person.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of go back to that cupcakes, right? And it can seem very overwhelming if you're thinking about like all that ERGs can be. And I'm happy to share any information that I have, so you can reach out after, and I'll share kind of our starter kit for ERGs here at Envoy when we were like 50 people. I think it can be as simple as understanding what your employees want. Are they already building community? If so, how do you just partner with them to amplify or to provide structure for them? When I walked into Envoy, the people, like I said, they had already kind of created this concept themselves, were meeting monthly for lunch. And they were inviting whoever was interested in the topic of DEI and building community, and recognizing the diverse groups that they were from. So it really started with those lunches that happen monthly. And then I happen to come here and be like, wow, there's these lunches, there's these communities, everything is kind of growing on its own. How can I support it? So I think, start the conversation, amplify work and interest that's already going on. And you can start as simple as a lunch meetup. It's on site. It's not taking anybody's time outside of work. And maybe you can go grab lunch and bring it in, go off site, and keep it simple.
What is the biggest myth you believe we have adapted towards doing DEI work?
Oh, myth. Oh, this is a tough question. I've never. There's 2 things. First, and this is the hardest for me too, because I'm so passionate about the work, is that there is like a silver bullet to this. And I think when we approach this from if you just do this one program, if you just do this one thing, everything will be solved. I have not seen that work. And I think it sometimes scares people away from doing the work because they try to implement this one solution, this silver bullet, and then when they don't see the change that they would have liked, then it's very frustrating and demotivating. So there's a myth that somebody's figured it all out and that there is one right way to do this, which is why I go back to this integrated approach, which is this needs to just be weaved into the entire employee experience, into your employee experience, so really tailor it in that way. The second one that I was thinking of is just that this is going to get solved overnight, that it's just a matter of reading a book or attending a seminar, and then it's just all going to be solved. And these are complex issues. They're issues that we're dealing with outside of work in society. And I think we all have to kind of acknowledge that, hold that space when we're doing DEI work.
And Lene, do you offer internal trainings on DEI to your HR and talent team who might not have a background in DEI?
Yeah, one of the first things we did is we did bring in, and there's, controversial opinions about this, but we did bring in a facilitator and speaker to talk about unconscious bias. And in particular, I wanted them to shape that around the hiring experience because we were about to double the organization, which I think is a key inflection point that we need to be deliberate about who we're hiring when we're doubling the organization. So we had those workshops workshops held internally here. I've pivoted a little bit in that I want HR and talent team to get that. I also want all managers to be exposed to this. So I've made this same workshop a part of the core management curriculum that we're exposing all of our people to here, all our managers here at Envoy, we're exposing them to that. So I think that outside training, outside perspective reminders are really great. And then I think it's about building processes that make sure that you have the checks and balances in place so that you can make sure that you're adhering to these great practices and thoughts that you get from the training.
And we have time for about 2 more questions. The first one is, what are your thoughts about initiatives being championed by top leadership at the organization? For example, CEOs, VPs of HR, head of recruiting, etc.
Yeah, we're talking about this right now at Envoy, and I could tell you, how we approached it at other companies as well. My belief is this should not be one person's mandate or scope. It should not be one function's mandate or scope, that this needs to be a partnership. I do think that the leaders in the organization have a bigger role in this partnership, just as they have a bigger role in making sure that, you get the feedback you need to grow your career, that you're treated fairly every single day, that you have the tools and systems to do your work and be effective. You take on a bigger role when you choose to be a manager or leader. So it's really just about that, leveraging every single person in the organization, outsized, role and responsibility with the leadership team. But having said that, I don't think you have to wait to do the work until you have leadership buy-in. I think that there are small everyday things when you really just start with your culture, start with how you do things around here. This could be as simple as, if you're a talent acquisition and you're doing an intake meeting with a manager, raising a question and saying, how do we think about diversity when it comes to building your team? How do you want me to weave that into my sourcing and into my interview, into the interview process? I don't think you need to wait for leaders to have a plan and to communicate that to you in order to ask a question as simple as that. So yes, I think you need it. And I think you can do some of the work as the organization maybe matures into that place if you don't have a leader that's already just passionate about it.
And our last question is, how do you create an environment that empowers your underrepresented population to speak out and continue to hold the company accountable?
Yeah, this is, we have lots of feedback mechanisms here. I think it's a very kind of tech San Francisco way to build a culture and do business, which is like providing lots of feedback outlets. And I love it. And I want to carry that spirit as we go global and expand everywhere in the world. So I would say if you don't already have feedback loops and feedback mechanisms, put them in place. And I'll share a little bit about what we do here. And it's very similar to what we did at Twitter. So there's some consistency there. But weekly, we have a channel where people can ask questions about anything in the organization. And I will tell you that this topic comes up at a minimum monthly. And really great, insightful questions that make us think as an organization, where do we stand? How do we want to represent this? Where do we evolve in this place? So I had that both at Twitter and at Envoy, which I very much appreciated. We also have a proxy program. So sometimes you don't feel safe. And we have identified proxies within the organization, or you can use your manager or leader, where you can bring up some of those questions where maybe, you want to talk it through before it's represented. So we have that, and we answer proxy questions on a weekly basis as well. And then we have some bigger systematic things. We do a weekly pulse. And in that weekly pulse, people can ask questions of their manager and kind of get some insight on things around DEI, how they feel, whether or not it's an inclusive environment. And then 2 times a year, we do an engagement survey. And for the first time ever, we've created a diversity, equity, and inclusion section, so its own section. Previous to that, we would look at the scores and make sure that groups did not have a material difference between their experience and their engagement level. But now we've created a section in our engagement survey. So again, I would look around at like all the mechanisms and places that you collect feedback from your employees and integrate DEI into that, make it a part of it. And I get so much good feedback and so many ideas, because employees really are the power behind this, from those feedback tools.
Thanks so much, Lene. That's all of the questions that we have at this point. And I'm going to turn it over to you and Boris for just wrapping up.
Well, thank you so much, Lene. I really appreciate your time and everything that you were able to share with us. And thank you, everyone, for joining such valuable takeaways, including practical tips and techniques, along with the broader takeaway, which sounded like a ton of respect and authenticity for where you personally and your company may specifically be in the DEI journey. So thank you so much again, Lene, and everybody. And with that, we'll be sending out the recording for everyone to enjoy thereafter and posting it to our website, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.